Good evening, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight for a very, very special talk. If you have not been upstairs to the third floor of the McLaughlin Wing to see the exhibition with Chester Higgins' work and also the work of P.H. Polk, I would encourage you to do so. If you've already seen it, go back again and again. Some absolutely fabulous photographs by both of these world-class artists. And it's part of our ongoing series of the Black Photographers Annual. I want to recognize Dr. Sarah Eckhart, who's our Associate Curator for Contemporary and Modern and a photography specialist among many specialties. Sarah, thank you very much for curating these shows. And our fearless Deputy Director and Chief Curator, Michael Taylor, who is in charge of all of this. And the exhibition comes to us through the generosity of one of our trustees and her husband, Dr. Crutcher and Dr. Crutcher. Dr. Betty Crutcher is on the Board of Trustees here, and Dr. Ronald Crutcher, who is the president, as I hope all of you know, of the University of Richmond. Dr. Crutcher, thank you, Ron, for your very generous support to make this possible. Now, if you don't know much about Chester Higgins, let me give you the highlights. And I think what you want to do is hear him speak. He's also got the best smile of any photographer I've ever met, which is important when you're on the other side of the camera, especially if you work for the New York Times as a staff photographer for nearly 4 decades. Now, I know, very impressive. But the list of his mentors is even more impressive. First of all, though, and a connection, I'll go back for a moment, raised and grew up in Alabama, went to Tuskegee, which of course I believe everybody has heard of, the world-famous university in Alabama, graduated from there, and in the process had mentors that included Romare Bearden, and then a couple of photographers you may have heard of somewhere along the way, like Cornell Kappa and Arthur Rothstein. I mean, world-class photographers just like he is. A little of that probably rubbed off on him, but I would have to say that, and as a photo historian, Chester's work is his. It doesn't follow any of his mentors very closely, influenced by them, but influenced by them with a commonality that's really important. That is this very keen eye for humanity, a very keen eye for a glimpse of a moment, taking a snapshot of time, not a snapshot in the casual sense, but being able to capture the emotion of his subjects, being able to capture the atmosphere of what he's seen, and being able to capture the essence and meaning of what happens, or is what's happening. And it's pretty remarkable. Now, mind you, as somebody that works for a newspaper, and arguably one of the best newspapers ever in the world, their deliberateness in terms of what they want to have illustrated with a photograph was very precise. But I have to say, of all of the many photographers, and there have been other great photographers that have worked for the Times over the many years, Chester's work really stands on its own and alone in a way because it is vastly different and in many ways superior to everybody else. I've long admired his work, and the books that he's produced, the bodies of work from various parts of the world that he's traveled, is nothing short of remarkable. So we are absolutely privileged and honored to have him come back yet again to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. He may be a New Yorker and an Alabaman, but we consider him an honorary Virginian. So Chester, welcome back to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and thanks for being here. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know when I've had such an exceptional introduction, but maybe I have, but let me say this. I'm glad that this exceptional introduction was witnessed by my wife. Thank you very much for everybody for coming out. I want to share with you what I do and how my work came to be. And the first thing I want to do is for people who believe in the spirit, people who believe in ancestors, I have to acknowledge the fact that we all stand on the shoulders of somebody. And for me, I stand on the shoulders of my first mentor who opened my eye and encouraged the confidence of my eye, and that was P.H. Polk. P.H. Polk was a photographer at Tuskegee. There were several photographers at Tuskegee, but P.H. Polk was the one that was always sort of moving around the campus and had a relationship with the students, and I had to hire him to do some pictures for me once as a business manager for the newspaper. And while at his home studio, I noticed this picture and a few others that were hidden on the wall behind a dark curtain that was part of his studio. And it really piqued my curiosity. And I said, Mr. Polk, what are these pictures? They don't look like anything that you do now. He said, well, these pictures were made in the 30s, and it was a personal project of his that when people from the rural area or the country will come into town on a weekend for market day, every now and then he would glimpse somebody who he thought were a very strong character. And then he would run out of his house and chase that person down and beg them to come back into the studio to make a picture, and he would offer them money. He said, well, you know, you're going to the market, how much money you have to spend, I don't know, but I'm gonna give you $5 to let me make your picture. So that was a no-brainer, especially since he said it's only gonna take about 10 or 15 minutes. So he captured these people who, and this woman specifically, who I think probably graduated from Woman 101 class, with their dignity and their spirit and their wholeness intact. And why was that such a big thing for me in 1967? It was because living in Alabama, living in the South, we all have become inured with the imagery that we see of people, our people, in the media, because we only fit within two categories, and that was either villain or victim. And here Mr. Polk had pointed a direction with his camera, in a direction that we all knew existed because we lived in this community. But he had enshrined it in a document, a visual document that we give value to. And that visual document, seeing those images, really excited me and opened my eyes to, well, at the same time authorized me to say, well, why not make these kinds of pictures? Because I had the perfect subject for these pictures. My great uncles and my great aunts in this little village I grew up in Southeast Alabama. So let me show you, so first I give honor to the memory of Mr. Polk and to his work. And if not for Mr. Polk and meeting Mr. Polk and seeing this work, I would not be a photographer and I would not be here now honoring his work. Mr. Henry Baker, when in the 80s, I decided to do a book called Some Time Ago, a historical portrait of blacks in America. And as a Star Trek fan, I was thinking, well, you know, given my attitude about my people and looking at the images that have been produced in this country about my people, if I had the ability to have a time machine and go back, what kind of pictures would I produce? So that led me on maybe a 5-year trek of looking for these old pictures that other people had made, and then looking inside of those pictures to extract the ones that appealed to me that I think I would have made. So I went and I visited a lot of homes of older people. I looked at a lot of pictures that came out of shoeboxes that were in attics. And I went to libraries and black colleges and the Library of Congress, trying to pull together these images. And a portfolio of Mr. Polk's images was seminal to this work. And this picture is the one that we used on the cover. This was my effort to introduce his work to the rest of the country. And in that period also, the Black Photography Angle was publishing works of photographers that were unknown. And when I submitted a portfolio to them of my work, I also suggested to them, look at these pictures from some time ago and Mr. Polk's work, and that's how that came to be. There's another great image of Mr. Polk with his big camera in his studio. And Dr. Campbell and his family, because of Mr. Polk, in later years of Dr. Campbell's life, I went out with him to some country clinics that he had. That we were looking at people, at their condition. And this is Mr. Polk's, I guess, first and only wife. They had a lot of children, and Mr. Polk, if anybody knows Mr. Polk, was a lover of women. So that, and you know, things happen. So that was his wife. So now this brings me to my work. So seeing these pictures of Mr. Polk made me realize that I had subject matter in my own hometown, not because I was thinking about being a photographer, but because I was thinking that there are some people in my hometown who I love very dearly, who are older people. They are my great aunts, my great uncles, and their relatives. And I realized that there were no pictures of them that exist. Photography is an expensive thing to have your portrait made. My mother, being a school teacher, had a portrait made every year. But to go to a studio, and there was no studios anyway, and the Black people could go to in my county, I made it my decision to make sure that my relatives would not die without having a picture of themselves to put on their walls, because I knew what was on their walls. They had the Farmer's Almanac, they had the painting of Jesus Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, and they had, there was some company that was making these scripture, 8x10 scripture things, and had this metallic sort of stuff, and those are the three things they had on their wall. And I wanted to make sure that my great aunt Shug, who I love very much, and her brother, my great uncle March 4th, McGowan, that there was a picture that I can make that would give honor to them, to their life, and thanks for their effect on me as a child and as a young adult. So a year and a half after my encounter with Mr. Polk, I had made enough money to get a good camera that had a light meter in it, and I headed home to make these pictures. Because I couldn't, another reason I had to do this is because as a student, I didn't have the money to pay Mr. Polk to go make these pictures. So if this was something I wanted to happen, then I had to find a way to make it happen myself. So it took time. And in that time, I learned the craft. And I went home and I started in visiting my relatives. Then I started making portraits. And this is a portrait of my great aunt at her gate to her house. My great aunt was a midwife. But she and her husband, Uncle Noah, were very respected in the community, which I found interesting because most people who were respected in our community were either because they were educators or religious people, of which they were neither. And I found it interesting that when people passed her house, the women who passed her house and their children would stop and salute her. They would stop in the street, in the dirt street. They would turn to her and then they would bow. And my Aunt Shug, who was on the porch in her rocking chair, would acknowledge them and they would keep going on. Or if I was with my Aunt Shug and she went to a community event and she came into the room, the people would stand up. And I'm like, wow, it's all because she had delivered everybody's children and people who were there, and she had taken care of them when they were sick. Then I later come to realize that it was my Aunt Shug and her brother, my great-uncle March 4th, who would be the last person to sit with dying friends at night. They explained to me that most people, because of the moon, most people die, they tend to die between midnight and sunrise. And when people are ailing and are very sick and on their way out, a lot of friends, it would be easy to find people to take the day shift. It wasn't so easy for people to find people who take the night shift, and they took the night shift. And I learned a lot about death and dying by talking to them about this. But what I want to point out in this picture is that she has an apron on, and this apron has a pocket. And in this pocket, she has two things. She has a handkerchief, and that handkerchief is how these old people carried their money. They would tie up on one end of the handkerchief their coins, and then on the other end of the handkerchief, they would fold their bills and tie that up. So inside that is what she has in her pocket. But the little black thing that you see is a newer version, a modernized purse that's also added to it. So as I showed you earlier, Mr. Polk's Woman 101 picture with the hands on the hip, years later, because Mr. Polk worked in the studio, and I tell people that, to me, reality is my studio. I very seldom pose things in the studio. But here is a similar, in another generation, a younger generation, of a woman taking a position that, I'll hear you out, but the answer is no. Willette Coleman. And this is one of the images that John Sarkowski selected to be in the collection to Museum of Modern Art. And this is another image. This is a friend of Betty Crutcher's, Joyce Carter. Now she's married. Joyce Carter, German, yeah. These three Tuskegee friends used to hang out all the time. Betty, Addie, and Joyce. And as painters, when they're trying to perfect their art, they get a model and work with. So I'm a photographer trying to perfect my art. So I'm making everybody's pictures. And some people, I make a lot of pictures of. I sort of badger them. That's probably not a good way of putting it. But I was always asking for the opportunity to let me make your picture. So that Joyce, who had this huge afro. In fact, I made a picture of Joyce and her friend Addie, who had no afro, straight hair. And Addie was profiled, Joyce looking straight at us. And I'd given a print to Addie, and Addie said her girls had gone to college, at some female college, and she had the picture, but she hadn't put it up. And they came back, and she had put the picture up on the mantle, and they said, whoa. She said, oh, you guys look like a strong, lesbian couple here. But it was not like that. So with my camera, the world being my studio, I went to try to photograph my people, because my analysis of things is that when you look at the images of people of African descent in this country, there's three things back then that were missing, and still are not enough of. And that's the issue that takes away our wholeness, because the issues of decency, dignity, and virtuous character do not fit into the equation, especially if your equation is only villain and victim. I've spent a lot of time in barbershops, and because that's a place where, guys hang out. But what was interesting about this picture that I found in this thing is that, in Alabama, we had few heroes. And unfortunately, this picture is made after all three of them had been killed. And I tell people that here we have three Ks. We have King, Kennedy, and Kennedy. And I say these are the three Ks that we can live with. And so they're prominent in this barbershop. When I reached New York in '69, summer of '69, I came to New York because I realized that, okay, I may have a very positive attitude about how I want my people to look, but how's that going to influence the national discussion, the national argument? And it's only going to influence that if I can find a way to make my art compelling enough to stand on its own on the national stage. So I came to New York in '69, and I went to a newsstand, and I picked up all the magazines that used photography well. I looked at the masthead, and I looked to see who were the picture editors. And I called them up, and I says, look, I'm a student photographer from Alabama. We don't have any schools to study photography. But first of all, I want you to know I'm not calling you because I'm looking for a job. But what I am calling you for is that you probably see the best photographers. And I wish you would take a look at my work and tell me how far of a gap do I have to bridge so that my work can become compelling. A couple people were very nice to me. A couple of people had no idea, how they could be of help, because I was really looking for a teacher. And I remember this one day I went to Look magazine, and I'm being interviewed Sam Young is talking to me and looking at my work, and didn't have much to say to me that was instructive. And just fortuitous, this older bald-headed gentleman stuck his head in the door, and he gave a few instructions to Sam. And it made me feel the guy had to be the boss because Sam's spine started to straighten up. So then after Sam received his instructions from him, the man says to Sam, he said, well, what's this? Who's this? And Sam said, well, it's this kid from Alabama, from Tuskegee, who wants to be a photographer. So he said, okay, when he finishes, send him in to see me. So I look at the door closed, I look at Sam. Sam said, well, I'm finished. You should go out the door and make a right. So I did that. And I walked into this guy's office, and he sat down. He said, okay, tell me, what's your mission? What do you got? What do you want to do? So I told him. And I says, I really want to learn how to correct the negative image of my people in photography. He said, well, that's a pretty tall order. I said, well, but, it's the only one that's, to me, that's worthwhile doing. So he said, okay, let me see what you have. So I put some pictures in front of him, and he looked at them, then he opened a drawer, and he took 4 sheets of blank paper, and he took these paper and he made a frame inside the picture I have. And he called me over and he said, look, here's your picture. This other stuff is waste. I looked at it and said, wow. I was even surprised that I had made that picture. But it was a picture I had made without knowing that I had made, because had I known what it was to isolate, then it would have been a much better picture. So that conversation went on for 2 hours, teaching me what I knew. I'd found a teacher who could teach me the linguistics of seeing. So at the end of that, I said, well, look, Mr. Rothstein, can I go out tomorrow? Give me a practice assignment so I can come back and show you, if I'm thinking this through, if I'm understanding this. He said, sure. He said, here, take some film, which was really a big thing because as a student, I had been living on rolling. You guys probably don't know anything about this, but for those of us who had no money, they will sell film in 100-foot rolls. And you get a chance in the dark to roll your own 36 exposures, tear it off, and process it and do another. So I said, wow, I have fresh film, Tri-X film. And I said, okay. I said, well, great. I said, well, I'll find a place to process it. He said, oh, don't worry, bring it back. We'll process it. And look at it. I said, wow, okay. But and then we went through it. And what I learned was that in looking at the contact sheet, that what he was interested in is how I develop a thought, how you develop a sentence, and how you develop a paragraph. I learned it's no different visually how you develop a thought. So when I started teaching in NYU years later, to a senior class and class of filmmakers, I did the same thing. I didn't want to see prints. I just wanted to see contact sheets to see how you develop a thought. So that particular session that became a day, became a week, became a month, became the whole summer. And at the end of the summer, he sent me to see the photo collection at the Museum of Modern Art. And he called Grace Mayer, who was over that collection, and says, I'm sending Chester over to look at these pictures, show him, Delano, Lang, Walker Evans. So I went over, and I'm looking at these FSA photographs, and I'm just amazed. It's just great photographs. And then I'd come across this picture of these two kids and a father running in the dust. It's a Dust Bowl picture, I think, out in Oklahoma. And I turn it over, and it has this man's name on it who's been spending the whole summer talking to me. So the museum and Look magazine was at the time at the 52nd, I think, in Madison, and the museum was a block away. So I rushed back to his office, and I said, Mr. Rothstein, they got pictures of you over there, by you over there. He thought that was funny. So for years, this guy was a great presence in my life. He introduced me to Cornell Copper and Gordon Parks. And then he would invite me to come to his home, but I had a young family and I couldn't transport everybody to his house, so I never went up to visit him. Until when he died, I went to visit his widow and all of his friends. And I come to the house, and he has 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. And they all come up to me and they hug me, oh, Chester, Chester. And I'm like, I don't really know you. But thank you. And they said, no, we know you very well, because our father will come home for dinner and tell Chester stories. So this is an image in '69 that I made as I traveled around Harlem, and it's a young Black Panther. Because at that time, the Black Panthers were occupying a site that was on the corner of 125th and Frederick Douglass Boulevard, where, what was it called? Urban Renewal. And they had decimated, Urban Renewal had torn out a lot of Black businesses, and these Black Panthers occupied the site. They didn't want anything to go there unless it could be replaced by other Black businesses. And eventually it became the site for a 30-story building, state office building. But this young Black Panther his job was to defend, there were several of them, but in his particular area of defense, his job was to defend the perimeter and only let people in that they said could come in. But I wanted you to see, for so many of you, the image of the Black Panther in the major media has always been the same image that happened to me as a student at Tuskegee when we went to protest against George Wallace. Some of you may have heard of George Wallace. We went to protest against George Wallace, and the media was there, and it was a scary experience. But the next day in the newspaper, the pictures of us did not show us as American citizens petitioning the government. It showed us instead as thugs, potential arsonists, and rapists. And it made me realize that, only 2 things. That, yes, it was the narrative of a racist condition that we were living in. 2, that you can always tell everything you need to know about a photographer from looking at that picture. And it also told me that I really couldn't change the editors in Montgomery to run something different because of what they had to work with. But I could change maybe on another level, appeal to a national level of publications. So that's why I'm in New York, learning how to become good enough so that my images can be competitive enough that they will run. I can't make them stop running images that I think are unworthy of my people, but if I can manage to get on board to add to the diet, then that's what I wanted to do. So my image of the Black Panther may not be this horrible villain that some of you may have seen that Black Panthers look like, because they were still people. They were young, idealistic people. Here you have a father and his son and his friend, the sense of love, the sense of ownership, the sense of companion, and trying to show that, that We all love our children, and we all love to be parents. At the same time, in '71, after Tuskegee, I started traveling to Africa, my first trip. My mother was very upset because she said, "Son, that's a very long way." And I understood that, and also I was going by myself. I mean, don't have any money. And I'm hitchhiking, and I'm living in village to village, and I'm staying in people's homes. And I think that coming from a town of 800 people helped me in that situation, because I did not have this creature comfort dependency. I didn't need to be in a place with running toilet and beds and stuff. And I could eat out of a communal bowl that the family ate out of, and I could take my bath from a calabash, in a small bucket. And I would just hitchhike from village to village. I would attach myself to whoever looked like that was a good person to attach myself to. And through that person, I would then follow them throughout their life, and I would then learn the community and learn the people in that community. And this was made on a train that no longer exists, that you would go between Accra and Kumasi. And then after my first couple of years there, in talking to the people, living with the people, I realized that there was this fear among the people of being photographed. And the fear was that they didn't know how they were going to be depicted. And the reason this was an issue is because there were many stories of relatives in Europe or America who have looked in magazines and saw people who they knew. And these pictures of them were such pejorative images. So they were a little wary. Building trust was an issue, and living with them, but that's their right. So I decided, after the first 2 years, I sent pictures back to people. But you get back to home and you gotta reintegrate yourself here. So I felt guilty that it would take me months to send pictures. So I came upon this great idea using Polaroids. So from then on, I would take 2 large suitcases, one that had nothing but Polaroid film in it, and another one that had nothing but Tri-X film in it. And when I go to a new village, the first 2 days, I would not show my 35mm camera. I would only go out around with Polaroids. So when you're a photographer and you're in a village, who comes to you first when you open up your camera? It's the children. So you make pictures of the children, and then they're gonna run back home and show them to mom and their relatives. So then the next thing that happens if you do that in the morning, in the afternoon, the kids are coming to you to go make pictures of their moms and their relatives. And that way you also get a chance to see the inside of the village, and the inside of people's homes, and they get a chance to see you, and they get a chance to vibe you, which is very important, because building trust happens immediately when people vibe you. And the second thing, now they see how I see them, then it becomes a whole open equation. So by the third day, when I come out with my 35mm, because I'm staying there for a few weeks, the people, whoever didn't get a picture the first 2 days, want a picture. And they come to me and I say, well, I have no more film. I'm just making pictures with this camera. And then they're like, okay. And everybody's like totally comfortable, because what I'm trying to set up is an equation where I'm not a photographer, but a friend who happens to have a camera. So that as I move around, I can zen like water almost, because people know how I see them. We know each other. We've established some bridge of trust with each other, and I'm just there. I'm there, paying to eat, or there hanging out with different friends of mine, the new friends of mine, and it makes a big difference. So then I have then the opportunity to watch and to record as a friend, as a family, and that's how I'm able to get these images. And space, isolation of space, is a big thing of mine, because frankly I prefer to be alone, so I like space, and I can appreciate other people who want to expand in their space, and this is how this came to be. Starting in '69, I became aware of a lot of black poetry and a lot of black theater. The cultural scene in Harlem was incredible. And the man who really sort of gave the intellectual impetus to that was Amira Baraka. And so Amira Baraka would show up not only in Harlem, but in New Jersey and Newark and Brooklyn and Queens, and poets would gather and they would have this poetathon, for lack of a better word. Nikki Giovanni, Sonia Sanchez, the black poets, they were all the last poets, they were all performed. And it was really interesting because it was the nearest thing to me in the South, we had this experience during the Civil Rights period, because when we went out on marches, the night before the march at churches, there were always big singing to keep the people's spirit up. And that sort of got people through the march, what they had to deal with the uncertainty of the next day. So in the North, I found this interplay, this paradigm working out in a totally different sort of way. Where in the South, the singing was more of a group, where in the North, everybody was coalescing around individuals, strong individuals. And this I used in my book, Black Men. This was at a school up in Harlem, 134th Street. So one of the summers that I lived in Ghana, I made a very good friend. Actually, my first summer, I made a very good friend who became the facilitator for me for the whole summer. He called himself Bliss, but his real name is Kweku. And Kweku and I just roamed around Ghana and got to know the people, got to know all of his friends from Accra, from the coast all the way up to the border of Tamale, Novarango. And this is Bliss at home in the Volta region. His people were Ewe, which is on the border between Ghana and Togo. And Bliss was a dancer. He was a lot of things. And I was surprised when we got to Bliss's home, his parents' home, that he wanted to meditate. And I saw him putting his rug down to meditate, and I looked at it and I said, oh my God, this is, Quaker, let me do one thing. He said, what's that? I said, let me just change the rug. So I changed the position of the rug. I said, okay, now, because to me, I saw this picture of this thought, of these lines coming together, and it just, to me, it just worked, and that's how this came to be. And also in that summer, this is in a town called Tamale. One of the things I would do in the morning is that, people are running back and forth everywhere to central transportation hubs. There's always a lot of energy. And the central transportation hub in Tamale was the Chocho, or the buses, that open air buses. And I would just sit and just watch people. And one of the lessons I had learned from Look magazine from a photographer who was like 6'4", Joel Baldwin. I love his pictures of children. He came when he did this story in India. And I was talking to Joel about photographing children, and Joel says, most people, when they photograph children, they look down on children. He says, never do that. Always crouch to the level of the child, because that way you bring out the wholeness and the fullness of the child. Because what is a child except a small adult? So that was a lesson that I took to heart. And here you see a picture where that lesson, in addition to my paying attention to the child in their space, produced this picture from Tamale. Now this image, first of all, it's a natural assumption to assume that this image is made in some African or Middle Eastern country because of her dress, her veil, when in fact it was made outside my house in Brooklyn. One day I saw this woman and her family walking down the street, and it was just something about her spirit. I'm a big thing into spirits. And I rushed out to ask her husband, because I learned by living in in Muslim neighborhoods in Africa that photographers, women are not allowed to have, or the community frowns upon other men photographing women. So I understood the protocol, and the protocol was that I had to approach the father, the husband, which I did. And after a conversation, he agreed to let me photograph the family. So I was able to do the group and then single out each, him, his wife, his child, and that's how this picture came to be. But the reason I wanted this picture was because there was something about her spirit that was just so calm, that was so rich, that in spite of the fact that she was veiled, that it still came through. And I'm also one of those people who believe that the windows to the soul is the eye. So all of that worked for me. The collection of positive and negative space, of the spirit behind that you can see, that you can't see, or even, as some people have thought, it's a metaphor for how we black people living inside of a white culture are looking out into this white culture that's in front of us. So this is how the Muslim woman image came to be. African people have a very, I have found, most African people have a very consistent relationship with spirit and religion on the continent. And in Ghana, I discovered on Sunday mornings on the beach, you have a series of what the Ghanaians will call as charismatic faiths, groupings, who would line up the beach for sunrise services. Charismatics is what we would call in this country evangelical. So I went to photograph this sunrise service of this group. But then along the way, I noticed that people were having their own individual shrines. There was one instance where a father was praying over his son at sunrise, and here this man had demarcated a sacred space for his cross and for him and his prayer. So I'm always fascinated by how we humans carve out a place for ourselves to commune with the spirit. This is another of those spirit images. There's a group in Brooklyn. Reverend Johnny Youngblood started this group called Ma'afa. That's M-A-A-F-A. And Ma'afa is a Swahili word that means great destruction. And they use this word as their Holocaust word, what happened to people of African descent during the centuries of enslavement. But they have another twist on it, which I like. And they said, you can't help yourself if you're a victim. That's why you need a doctor. You have to get rid of victimhood. You have to get rid of victimology to, yes, the situation sucks, yes. Is everybody in the situation bad or good? It's a mix. You've got to work it through. But you have to feel the responsibility to work it through to make it better for you. So they have this week-long workshops that take people back through, starts off through the slave ships, through oppression, and they end with a rebirthing ceremony. And at the end of this rebirthing ceremony, there is this dance to the sea, because what's in the sea that connects us here, is the sea that connected West Africa, where they feel that the largest cemetery in the world are those bones of people of African descent who refused and who jumped overboard, who were killed or whatever, but they refused to be subjugated. And so this is an effort to use the water, to connect with the water that holds the bones as a way of reconnection and in a way of purification. And this is the last part of that ceremony that happens. So growing up, this is a very familiar scene to me because all of my relatives were very big on going to church on Sundays, sometimes 2 and 3 times on Sundays. So that you will always see the hands of, the old men or old women on the pews who would participate in the collective ceremony of rising and reading of the scripture, the singing of the hymns, pouring out their souls, and praying for a better tomorrow. This is a portrait I made. This is when I lived at a location on Classen Avenue. I can now call it 721 Classen Avenue Studio. And I was photographing locks. Now, a lot of people were calling it dreadlocks. And I had to learn to correct that they are not dreadlocks. There's nothing dreadful about them. They are locks. But the reason they were called dreadlocks is because the young kids in the Caribbean who were of middle-class kids were growing their hair this way, and their upright parents were very upset about this. And in their uprightness, they called it dreadful, dreadlocks, but that's a value judgment, but it's not what the hair is. So I wanted to capture this woman, her energy, her soul, her spirit in this space. Very simple with her and her locks. Sometimes, you come upon images, and I like this because neither one of them knew that I was ever there. But, I'm walking along the waterfront, and I'm seeing, the one thing I learned from Rothstein is, and also from Romy Bearden is that, there's a ceremony in life, that things happen, like 1, 2, 3, 4. So if, let's take something simple like a kiss. We all know what a kiss, how it happens and what it feels like. So if you're going to make a photograph of a kiss, your first clue may be the way that eyes are locked. And then your second clue may be the way that arms are holding the bodies, or they're positioned to each other. And then your third clue may be an embrace, and the fourth clue may be a tilting of the head and going and blah, blah. So what I've just graphed out for you is what Romy Bearden would call the ceremony of life, that everything exists in the ceremony. So if your interest is just to photograph the head lock, the eye lock, then that's position A. You can position yourself for that. If your interest is to capture the intensity of the kiss, which would then be position M, then you know where that is located and everything in between. So then that determines, based upon your knowledge of the graft of the human emotion, that then determines where you decide to position yourself to capture what at any particular time. So, seeing this couple sitting down, but locking eyes in such a way, and their body began to give way, I knew that this was coming. So then I had enough time then to head it off, because in photography, I think a lot of what we do is heading it off at the pass. Where do I preposition myself to head it off at the pass so that I capture it, but I don't invade it, and I don't disturb it, and I allow it to be. For the last 16 years, I've been traveling, my wife and I have been traveling to Ethiopia, spending 6 weeks every year in Ethiopia, and put in 6,000 kilometers on 2 cars, crossing the country looking for antiquity sites, historical documents, traditional ceremonies, looking at that religious world that is always seems to be present and in past. And a lot of you, I'm sure, know of the story in the Bible of Queen of Sheba. Well, Queen of Sheba, and I had to learn in my research that there's a corruption in the Bible when they talk about Queen of Sheba, because they use the words Candace, Queen of Sheba. What the word is actually, from the language, is Kendaki. Kendaki is the title of a female ruler, but it gets shortened as Candace. And Sheba actually is a place in Yemen, which was at one time the Aksumite Empire stretched across the Red Sea and controlled Yemen. And Sheba is a site where it was the summer palace of the Aksumites. When it was raining in the wintertime in Ethiopia, the rains are considered the winter because the temperatures drop. But to the Ethiopians, they call her Makeda. Her name is Makeda, Kendaki Makeda. Well, Kendaki Makeda, if you read the scriptures in the Old Testament, visit to Solomon would have happened around the 10th century BCE. And she and her son, a son that the Ethiopian says is because of she and Solomon having a relationship, became the first emperor of the Jewish nation state of Ethiopia. And they have this thing they call the glory of the kings, the Kabir Nagash. It talks about this. But her ancestors were people who believed in the old faith, and the old faith was the faith of the sky and sun. And they left behind these obelisks. There's only 2 places in Africa where you have huge carved dressed stone that is 6 to 10 stories high. And that's on either end of the Nile. One is in Egypt, where the pharaohs used them. They used them as a pair in front of each temple that were more like a billboard that talked about how great they were. And the Ethiopians used them, but they didn't inscribe them, but they are found on the tombs in Aksum of the past emperors and rulers. But there's something very different about these obelisks. In Ethiopia, the obelisks are circular like this, rounded top. And in Egypt, they are pointed. They come to a point like a pyramid point. And in those days, those pyramid points had a gold covering on them. So you can imagine the light sparkling from it. Now, these ones in Ethiopia, the rounded top, as I've over 20 years of photographing them, I'm trying to figure out what could it possibly mean. And the rounded top, I sort of believe, represents the arc of the sun. But if that's true, why the cutouts? I mean, with the stone we're talking about is something that's almost 3 feet deep and maybe 5, 6 feet across. Why cut out this stone? And for years, I really wrestled with this. And then it occurred to me, after traveling around the country, I noticed a difference in how the sun hits the horizon. In the southern part of the country, the sun hits the horizon like it does here on the ocean. You see the complete bottom of the sun. But in the highlands, the sun hits the clouds before it hits the horizon, and it breaks like this. So I had to go back. There was a thought. So I had to go back, and I had to climb, do something that nobody ever does with these obelisks, because everybody's looking at them from the front and up. I decided early before sunrise one morning I was going to climb. There was a mountain behind these obelisks. That I was going to climb these mountains behind it and find a point where I'm exactly level with the cutout and see what happens to the sun. And then the proof is there. That this is because why would they make a monument? Why would they make a lot of monuments, huge monuments, and have this particular design? So this proved to me, I thought, that they believed in nature. And then recently I came to find by my research that about 20 years ago, there was a cache of gold coins from Aksum that were found in Yemen that were buried. And they came on the market, and they were bought by the Ashmolean Museum of Oxford University. And these coins are the best coins ever in terms of detail that we've ever seen. And in these coins, they show things that shows that, one, there is a connection between the use of the serpents on the top of the crown that represent royal authority, and then there is the sun and the moon, but there's also the cutouts of these obelisks. Yes, the dividing line is an emperor by the name of Azana, who in 324 introduced Christianity and religion into Ethiopia, but these other coins predate Azana all the way back to before the Hebrew period. So now that I'm retired, I'm doing what a lot of old photographers do. They tend to look at nature. I've noticed that a lot of photographers start looking at flowers or rocks, shoreline, and I've decided that to challenge myself, because I believe that I have this thing about signature of the Spirit. I believe that everything exists at the pleasure of the Spirit. And I believe that there's a signature of the Spirit that weaves through everything, whether it's living or dead. So I decided that, okay, if I really believe that, can I show that? And I decided to start working with leaves, dead leaves. I did experimentation. I did, different leaves, and some worked, some didn't. I did, cross-section of small trees and things. But I finally decided on these huge leaves, and this is not it. What leaf is this? The hosta leaf. This is the hosta. Betsy she's the plant expert over there. A hosta. But I grow, and I'll show you, you'll see later, I grow elephant ears, and I photograph them because I like the way how they die back. And then not all of them work for me, but I hang them up, I live with them, and then there'll come a time when I feel the inspiration that it's time now to start working with some. And then I'll take them down and I start working with them. And this is how this came about. This is an elephant ear. I'm looking for the signature of the Spirit that, it's there, whether, you can't. We live in a close, contained bubble. Nothing escapes. It's all just recirculates, recycle. The Spirit is still there. And what really sort of got me into this because I had done portraits of mummies. And the royal mummies, you can see the people look like they were, and they have a feeling. You get a sense of who they are as a person. And that made me realize that, hey, let me look and see what I can do with these dead leaves. Now, here's a picture of the rock churches of Lalibela that you may have heard of, where in the 13th century, they built a whole new Jerusalem. 11 churches dug out of the rock. Instead of taking construction material to a site to build something, they took away portions of the site to leave a sculpture. So these are living sculptures. And I realized when I visit Ethiopia and I go into churches that nobody was there. And I came to find out that nobody is there in the daytime because church service for them starts about 5 a.m. in the morning. They finish at sunrise, which was, I was beginning to learn, the same calendar of the Egyptians. And if some of you may remember, when Christ was taken, he had said to the effect that before the sunrise, before the cock crows, da-da-da. So the temple time was before sunrise. So at sunrise, people come out of that, then they go deal with the rest of the day, but their time to worship is the hour to hour and a half before sunrise. That is the holiest time of the day for them. So it's one thing to live and be there and to experience this and to see this. It's something else to be able to capture it on film, of how to capture the stars. So I had to go learn the stars. I had to go learn to get a telescope and learn positioning of the sky. Then I had to learn how to do astrophotography, all to be able to pull this event together. And learning also, I had to take this thing, I think, has 5 strobes. I had to take my 5 different battery units that I had to buy and transport to Ethiopia with high extension rods, a lot of overweight, and to be able to make this picture. But this picture tells something to you that you would not know unless you have seen it in as many dimensions. And then in Ethiopia, how many of you have heard of Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds? Lucy is an Ethiopian. And her fossilized bones are at the museum in Ethiopia. And I gained permission to be able to photograph her. And the Ethiopians don't call her Lucy, they call her Dinkwanesh, which means you are a wonder. And this is what Lucy looks like. And in my new book that we're working on now, called Amen, The River of Faith, I want to dedicate it to Lucy. because we're looking at all of us are children of Lucy. You may have heard of this guy. He's Ramses the Great, who a major builder in Egypt, and I had special permission to photograph him. In Egypt, special permission means that you pay a lot of money, but to bring your lights in, to be able to do it, when people are not there, so you can look at it and work with it. And I've seen many different images of mummies, but I thought, to me, this was one that served with dignity and give us good information and a good feeling of what a mummy is like, and that's His Majesty. People and faith is a very strong theme for me, and here we're looking at another Muslim woman doing her salat. That's what the Muslims call prayer. That's the one thing that all Muslims feel like. If they're a full Muslim, they feel compelled to pray 5 times a day. And when I was in Egypt, I finally got to start understanding, we do Ash Wednesday for Catholics in this country. Well, if you travel to Egypt, you may see a lot of men with a black dot over their head. I think they call themselves the head bumpers or something like that. But it's a sign of how often they go down completely to prostrate themselves in giving their prayer. But here again, the space to be vulnerable with her as she approaches her God. Now, if there's a Mona Lisa in Ethiopia, this must be it. So the one year that I take my lights and I use them for 2 consecutive seasons in Ethiopia, and I leave them, and I left them there. The 3rd year I went back and I said, okay, I've never been to the South. I want to see the Southern tribes, but I really want to show them fullness in the best light. And I understand fashion studio. I've done it here in New York, but I can't bring them to New York. So I decided to use those lights and add backdrops and scrims, light boxes, and do a high fashion studio that I could fold up and travel village to village. And that's what we did for a month, for 6 weeks, traveling village to village and holding a meeting with the village elders and women and men, and saying what our mission, our purpose was, and asking people how they felt about being photographed, asking them how much should we pay them to be photographed, and then we photographed them, pay them, get their name, and go the next day and start all over again. And this is how this image came about. But there's something else here. I found it distressful to see so many images that have been made of African people where we look, where we are objectified, and in a very negative way. And then it borders on a subverted sort of attitude towards sexuality, especially if the female's breast is bare, and also with the men. So in this particular image, this is a young girl. She has past puberty, but if you notice, I tried to use the light and the composition in such a way that I tone down any sense of sexuality to try to deal with the person. And I've done that with the older women, middle-aged women, whatever, because, it's not about that. It's about trying to get the wholeness of the person, not to be distracted with other stuff. Here's another example. I found it quite interesting. These women women have a way of making adornments out of nothing. And what had happened here is that there was this plastic handle that go on top of these cans they use for carrying water or gas. They call them jerry cans. And this was on the border with Kenya in Ethiopia, where they sold beer in Kenya. And these women had figured out that if they take these beer caps and string them, and make hole in the top of these jerry cans, they would have these little things that they can carry around their hand, or they could put on the top of their head. It was just like I said, just brilliant. I loved it. And looking at relationships, looking at what love looks like. In a way, I like to think that my pictures, no matter what they are, shows what love looks like, because I'm loving what's in front of me. That's why I'm making a picture of it. And here's it's just a lovely, sweet moment. And I like to end with the burial walk. What really is just a group of witnesses to your life when you were here. You know, I have a friend who says that once you die, and the last person who knows you dies, and you never existed. And my great uncle, who had a great influence on me, was a caretaker for the cemetery. And because all the graves in the cemetery were not marked, or the markings did not last, when a new burial place had to be found, it was his job to take an iron rod and go around and poke the ground and find out where the burials were and find a virgin place. So, as a youngster, seeing people dig holes, I think once or twice I probably jumped into a hole, and I thought it was a very interesting perspective to be at the level of the earth looking across as opposed to looking down or whatever. So, seeing this final walk to the grave and witnessing all the witnesses of the people who love this person, I suddenly had an urge to assume that position that I had seen as a child, looking out of a newly dug grave, and that's how this image came to be. Thank you very much.